The smell of burning coolant hitting a hot exhaust manifold is a specific kind of bitter. It coats the back of your throat before you even realize something is wrong. I wiped a heavy line of black grease from my forehead with the back of my forearm, feeling the thick, unyielding denim of my work shirt sticking stubbornly to my shoulder blades. The coastal California heat was radiating off the cracked asphalt of Highway 1, creating shimmering mirages in the distance, but the heat coming off the engine bay of the black luxury sedan in front of me was much worse. I kept my eyes down. The hood was propped open, casting a sharp, angular shadow over the complex mess of German engineering. I reached past the bright yellow cap of the power steering reservoir, my fingers tracing the rigid, braided line of the upper radiator hose. There was a hairline fracture right at the neck of the clamp. Coolant was actively hissing out in a thin, aggressive mist, turning to vapor the second it touched the block. "Is it completely dead?" Her voice carried over the low, rhythmic hum of passing traffic. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't shrill. It was measured, carrying an undertone of someone who was rapidly calculating how much this exact moment was going to cost her. I turned my head just enough to catch her leaning against the front quarter panel of the car. Aurora. She was wearing a deep, structured red dress with a sharp neckline that felt entirely out of place on the gravel shoulder of a highway. A delicate gold chain rested against her collarbone, catching the harsh afternoon sun every time she shifted her weight. Her dark hair fell in loose, deliberate waves, framing a face that was strikingly composed for someone whose engine had just tried to cook itself from the inside out. She was older than me, carrying an undeniable air of authority that didn't waver even while stranded. She crossed her arms, watching my hands with intense, unabashed curiosity. "Not dead," I said. My voice came out flat, gravelly from a morning spent inhaling grinding dust. I kept the assessment purely technical. "But you're not driving it anywhere today. The upper hose split. You've lost about 80% of your coolant capacity. If you turn that ignition key again, you'll warp the cylinder head, and a $50 hose becomes a $5,000 rebuild." She let out a slow, deliberate exhale. She didn't complain about the heat. She didn't complain about the dirt settling onto the hem of her dress. She just tilted her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine, holding my gaze with a sudden, grounding weight. She watched me fix her car and asked, "Do you always save women?" I pulled a shop rag from my back pocket and wiped the worst of the grime from my knuckles. The coarse fabric caught on my calluses. "I fix machines," I corrected bluntly. "The machine doesn't care who holds the title." A faint, wry smile touched the corner of her mouth. That was the exact moment the afternoon stopped feeling like a routine roadside assist and started feeling like a liability. I turned my attention back to the hissing engine. "I have a roll of self-fusing silicone tape in my truck," I told her, pointing the heavy end of my wrench toward my beat-up 1970 flatbed parked 10 yards back on the shoulder. "It'll hold the cooling system pressure for about 10 miles. That's enough to get you to my shop down the coast. But you can't take the highway. You have to take the frontage road, and you have to keep the RPMs under 2,000. "I have a meeting in 45 minutes, Aurora said. The edge of tension finally bled into her tone, sharp and real. She checked a heavy silver watch on her left wrist. "It's a site inspection for a commercial build in the valley. If I am not standing on that concrete when the primary contractor arrives, they walk, and I lose the withholding." I stopped wiping my hands. I looked at the split radiator hose bubbling with green fluid. Then I looked at her dress, immaculate and professional. Finally, I looked at the desolate stretch of coastal asphalt stretching out in both directions. There were no cabs out here. Ride shares took 40 minutes to arrive. "Get in my truck," I said. The cab of my flatbed smelled like old leather, sea salt, and WD-40. She climbed in without hesitation, pulling the maroon fabric of her dress carefully around her knees to avoid the grease stains on the vinyl bench seat. I threw my canvas tool bag into the back, secured the hood of her sedan, and slid behind the large steering wheel. The space inside the cab was suddenly far too small. I kept my eyes strictly on the road, my hands gripped tightly at 10 and 2, refusing to let the proximity compromise my focus. "I'm Dean," I said, putting the heavy column shifter into drive. "Aurora." She pulled a thick, leather-bound tote bag into her lap and extracted a stack of folded blueprints. "And I appreciate this, Dean. I'll pay your shop's hourly emergency rate for the detour." "I'm not a taxi service," I replied, my tone clipped. I watched the temperature gauge on my dash out of habit. "I'm just making sure a warped engine block doesn't become my problem to rebuild later." We drove in silence for 20 agonizingly slow minutes. I listened to the steady rhythm of her pen scratching against the thick paper. She was reviewing contract clauses, completely absorbed in the work, her brow furrowed in concentration. I admired that. Most people would be frantic, checking their phones, complaining about their ruined schedule. She just adapted to the new constraint. I pulled up to the address she had given me, a half-finished, multi-story concrete structure surrounded by high chain-link fencing. A group of men in hard hats and high-visibility vests stood near a folding table in the center of the dirt lot, looking deeply impatient. "Wait here," I told her, shifting the truck into park and leaving the engine running. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a sharp click. "It's my site, Dean. I don't wait in cars." She stepped out of the truck, her heels crunching aggressively against the gravel. I watched from the open window of the cab as she approached the largest man in the group. He pointed aggressively at a structural pillar, his face turning red as he spoke. I couldn't hear the exact words over the idle of my V8 engine, but I saw her posture. She didn't shrink. She didn't cross her arms defensively. She unrolled her blueprints, slammed them onto the folding table, tapped a specific line of text with her pen, and spoke with calm, lethal authority. The man crossed his arms, leaning back. He stopped yelling. She was negotiating her own terms, dismantling his leverage piece by piece. I felt a sudden, sharp anchor of respect drop heavily in my chest. 10 minutes later, she rolled the blueprints back up and walked back to the truck. She looked exhausted. I noticed a small, high-frequency tremor in her left hand as she reached for the door handle. I didn't ask how the meeting went. I didn't push for details. I reached into my center console, pulled out a clean, sealed bottle of water, and handed it to her as she sat down. She took it, her cool fingers briefly brushing the rough, scarred calluses of my palm. A quiet stillness settled over the cab, blocking out the noise of the construction site. "They signed off on the Phase 2 delay," she said softly, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Good." I put the truck in drive. "Let's go fix your car." My shop was a massive, converted warehouse sitting just off the Pacific Coast Highway. It was loud, chaotic, cluttered with heavy red engine hoists, and smelled permanently of oxidized metal and brake cleaner. Over the next 3 days, while I waited for an original OEM radiator hose to be shipped from a distributor in Germany for her specific European sedan, Aurora essentially moved her entire mobile office into the corner of my waiting area. She needed a quiet place to work while the contractor dispute cooled off, and her apartment building was undergoing a massive internet outage. I didn't officially offer the space. She just showed up on Tuesday morning at 7:30 with a laptop, a stack of files, and 2 large black coffees in cardboard cups. "Black, right?" she asked, walking straight past the customer counter and setting a cup down onto my metal workbench. I looked at the coffee, then up at her. She was wearing tailored dark trousers today, her hair pulled up in a strict, no-nonsense clip. "Yeah," I said, picking up the cup. The heat soaked into my palm. "Thanks." I turned my back and went to the 1968 Mustang Fastback I was currently restoring. I was replacing the entire length of the hard fuel lines, a job that required absolute, unforgiving precision. I lay down on the plastic creeper, sliding under the heavy chassis, the cold steel of the undercarriage hovering mere inches from my face. I reached up, trying to thread the flanged end of the steel line into the fuel pump housing. I needed a 5/8-inch flare nut wrench. I reached out blindly with my left hand, patting the cold concrete floor where I thought I had left my tray. Suddenly, the exact wrench was pressed firmly, handle first, into my palm. I stopped. I gripped the wrench, tightened the fitting, and then slid out from under the car. Aurora was standing there, wiping a tiny speck of black grease from her thumb with a tissue. "You looked frustrated," she said simply, not breaking eye contact. I wasn't frustrated, I muttered, though the tight knot in my shoulders miraculously loosened. I was calculating torque. "Sure." She turned and walked back to her laptop in the corner. It became a routine, a dangerous, quiet routine. She worked on her architectural renderings. I rebuilt Holley carburetors and bent stainless steel lines. We barely spoke for hours at a time, but the silence wasn't empty. It was a functional shield against the noise of the outside world. I found myself unconsciously anticipating the rhythmic sound of her typing. I noticed when she forgot to eat lunch. On Thursday afternoon, I walked over to her desk, placed a wrapped deli sandwich next to her mouse, and walked away. I didn't say anything. I just went back to the grinding wheel, letting the sparks fly against the steel guard. I watched out of the corner of my eye. She ate it 10 minutes later. The tension in my jaw finally relaxed. The fundamental shift happened on Friday evening. The coastal fog had rolled in thick off the ocean, dropping the ambient temperature in the bay by 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. I was wiping down my socket set with a rag when I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath from her corner of the shop. I looked over. Aurora was staring dead at her laptop screen. The harsh blue glow of the monitor caught the sudden pale shock, draining the color from her face. I dropped the rag and walked over, stopping exactly 3 feet from her chair, keeping a respectful distance. "What is it?" She didn't look at me. Her eyes were tracking lines of text on the screen rapidly. "Notice of injunction," she said, her voice sounding completely hollowed out. "The primary contractor from Tuesday. They're trying to freeze my operating accounts until the site dispute is formally resolved in binding arbitration. They claim I violated a critical safety timeline by delaying the Phase 2 bracing." She gripped the edge of the cheap wooden desk. The tremor was back in her hands, much worse this time. She was watching her entire livelihood, everything she had built, get tied up in legal red tape in real time. I didn't offer her empty comforts. I didn't tell her it would magically be okay. I leaned forward slightly, looking at the digital document on her screen, scanning the dates, the cited legal clauses, and the timestamps. "They filed this at 4:55 p.m. on a Friday," I stated, letting the cold facts ground the rising panic in the room. "They're trying to leverage the weekend to make you sweat. They know the courts are closed. When is the city safety inspector scheduled to walk the site?" "Monday morning, 8 a.m., she whispered, finally looking up at me. "But if I can't pay the secondary welding crew to finish the structural bracing by Sunday night..." I turned around and pulled my heavy canvas work jacket off the iron hook by the bay door. I walked back over and draped it carefully over her shoulders. It was far too big for her, smelling strongly of old leather and sawdust, but the physical weight of it seemed to stop her shoulders from shaking. "What bracing?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into absolute problem-solving mode. She looked up, startled by the heavy jacket, then at my face. "The load-bearing temporary supports on the second floor? It requires customized 3/8-inch steel plating. My supplier won't release the raw materials without the cleared funds from the frozen account." "I have steel," I said, "and I have a plasma cutter." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Dean, no, this isn't a vintage car frame. This is commercial structural engineering. You can't just..." "Show me the blueprints," I interrupted. I pulled up a heavy wooden stool beside her. I didn't touch her. I kept my hands firmly planted on my own knees, maintaining the physical boundary. Show me the exact load requirements and the dimensions. If it's metal, I can cut it. If it bears weight, I can weld it. For a long, agonizing moment, she just looked at me. The defensive, professional walls she kept so carefully constructed seemed to crack just a fraction of an inch. She reached out, her finger tracing a thick black line on the digital schematic. "Here," she said. 3/8 inch thick minimum, 8 corner plates, 16 bolt holes per plate. We worked until 3 a.m. I cut the heavy steel sheets, she calculated the exact tolerances and marked the drill points with a soapstone pencil. The blinding white sparks from the plasma cutter lit up the dark, cavernous shop, casting long, frantic shadows against the exposed brick walls. It was brutal, physical work. My forearms ached and my vision blurred from staring through the dark glass of the welding mask. But every single time I turned off the torch and flipped the mask up, she was right there. She handed me the next measurement, checked the cooling edges with a square, and marked the next cut. We were a machine operating in perfect sync. By Saturday morning, the 8 massive steel plates were loaded into the back of my flatbed. We drove to the construction site in the gray, misty pre-dawn light. The skeletal concrete structure was completely deserted, wrapped in a heavy silence. "We have exactly 14 hours to install these before the site manager does his weekend lockup protocol," she said, her voice raspy from exhaustion and breathing in metal dust. "Then we don't waste time talking," I replied. I hauled the heavy steel up the temporary bowing wooden stairs, one plate at a time. She guided the exact placement against the concrete pillars, her architectural precision perfectly matching my physical execution. I drilled the masonry anchors, the heavy, violent impact of the hammer drill rattling my teeth and sending plumes of silica dust into the air. She secured the heavy hex bolts behind me, torquing them down to spec. We didn't stop to eat. We barely stopped to drink from the warm water bottles in the truck. The sun climbed higher, baking the concrete dust into our clothes and our skin. At noon, we hit a complication. I was attempting to secure the final plate near the edge of an open, unguarded elevator shaft on the 3rd floor. I leaned my weight into the heavy drill. My steel-toed boot slipped on a patch of loose, crushed gravel near the edge. I lost my balance entirely, my center of gravity shifting dangerously outward toward the 30-foot drop. Aurora lunged. She didn't scream. Her hand clamped onto the heavy leather of my tool belt, pulling backward with absolutely all her strength. It wasn't enough to physically drag a 200-pound man backward, but it was enough resistance to shift my momentum just a fraction of an inch. I dropped hard to one knee, my bare hand slapping violently against the rough concrete floor to catch myself, my knuckles scraping raw. I stayed there on my knee for a full second, breathing hard, staring down into the dark, empty shaft. The drop was unforgiving, lined with exposed, rusty rebar at the bottom. "Dean," she gasped, the sound tearing out of her throat. I stood up slowly, dusting the rocks from my jeans. I turned and looked at her. Her face was paper white, her breathing rapid and shallow. The absolute, unadulterated terror in her eyes wasn't for the building project. It wasn't for the delay. It was for me. "I'm fine," I said, my voice coming out much lower and rougher than intended. She stepped closer, closing the 3 feet of distance we had carefully maintained all week. She didn't throw her arms around me. She didn't hug me. She just reached out and gripped the heavy canvas of my work shirt right over the center of my chest. Her knuckles were white with tension. The transfer of stability was instantaneous and absolute. Her panic flowed directly into the steady, even rhythm of my heartbeat. My grounded calm flowed back through her arms into her shaking hands. The chaotic noise of the wind whipping through the open construction site vanished into complete silence. We stood there on the edge of the drop, tethered by nothing but fabric, gravity, and a sudden, undeniable understanding. "Don't do that again," she ordered, her voice shaking violently. "I won't," I promised, looking down at her hands holding me in place. We finished securing the last plate by sunset. The supports were flawless, completely exceeding the safety code requirements. We packed the heavy tools into the metal boxes in the truck in complete silence. The driving adrenaline of the day was gone, leaving behind a heavy, profound physical exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. When we finally pulled back into the gravel lot of my shop, the overhead bay lights were on. Her sedan was sitting in the center bay, fully repaired. The new OEM radiator hose had been delivered and installed, the cooling system bled, pressurized, and fully tested. I tossed my heavy tool belt onto the wooden bench and walked over to the pegboard. I picked up her car keys, the metal cold against my calloused palm. She stood near the open bay door, silhouetted against the fading purple coastal light. She looked at the sleek black car, then slowly shifted her gaze to the keys in my hand. The realization that the practical crisis was entirely over hit the room like a physical weight dropping from the ceiling. There was no mechanical reason for her to stay anymore. The injunction would be fought and won on Monday. The engine was fixed. The void I usually ignored in my life felt suddenly acutely present, opening up like the elevator shaft we had stood beside hours ago. "The inspector will pass the site on Monday," I said, forcing my tone to remain level and professional. "You have the photographic proof of the bracing. Your accounts will unfreeze by Tuesday." "I know," she said. She didn't move a single inch toward the car. I walked over to her. I didn't hand her the keys immediately. I held them in my open palm, my arm resting heavily at my side. I wanted to ask her to stay. I wanted to pull her out of the cold, drafty doorway and into the warmth of the small office in the back. I clenched my jaw, fighting the incredibly selfish impulse. I had to let her dictate the boundary. I had to let her walk away if that was what she needed. "Your car is good to go," I finally said, holding out the keys toward her. "There's no charge for the hose or the labor. Consider it a fair trade for the architectural lesson on load-bearing tolerances." She looked down at the keys resting in my palm. She didn't raise her hand to take them. "I don't want to go back to my empty apartment, Dean," she said quietly. I froze, the air catching in my lungs. "Aurora, I spent my entire adult life building massive, complex systems," she continued, her voice incredibly steady but carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "Calculations, blueprints, safety margins. I thought if I just controlled every single variable, I would never feel like the floor was dropping out from under me." She looked up, her dark eyes finding mine, stripping away all the pretense. "But you didn't give me a blueprint when everything collapsed. You just gave me a wrench. You didn't give me a speech telling me I was safe. You just physically made sure I was." She reached out. She didn't take the car keys. Instead, she placed her hand flat over mine, wrapping her fingers tightly around my closed fist. "I'm staying here," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a concrete, immovable decision. I let out a slow, shaky breath. The constant defensive vigilance I carried in my chest, the wall I kept between myself and the world, finally cracked and shattered. I didn't pull her into a frantic, desperate embrace. I didn't need to. I simply opened my hand, letting the metal car keys drop onto the solid concrete floor with a sharp, final clatter. I turned my hand over, intertwining my rough fingers with hers. The grip was firm, functional, like a locked joint between two load-bearing steel beams. The endless wandering stopped. The silence in the shop finally felt like coming home. I learned that true safety isn't found in trying to rigidly control every detail of your life. It's found in finding a partner who holds completely steady when the floor suddenly drops out from under you. Real love isn't about dramatic, chaotic rescues. It's the quiet, reliable consistency of showing up, tools in hand, ready to build something that lasts. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.